Time to take a look at your money this morning. And first, let's get a weekly stock market recap at close of day Friday. The S&P 500 and the Dow Jones Industrial Average both dropping by nearly 3 points. NASDAQ not far behind in losses, dropping by 2.7 points. Hurricane Ian left a devastating mark across the state of Florida as residents look to recover. Many are now facing financial impacts left behind by the storm. Here in the Midwest, we often are left to deal with the aftermath of tornadoes and flooding and other events as well. Our financial expert, Mark Ravicheski, joining us live now to share how to best financially prepare for some type of natural disaster. Mark, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Hey, good morning, David. Good to see you again. Happy Monday.
Yeah, happy Monday. And so from the flood of 2019 to the derecho of 2020, we are definitely no stranger to Mother Nature's wrath. So how do we prepare for a financial disaster?
Well, the general rule, David, is to set aside enough money to cover, about 3 to 6 months of living expenses. But one of the biggest factors to consider if you should set aside, even more money, say, 6 to 12 months of living expenses, is your ability to return to work once that initial disaster is over. Because what we're seeing now in Florida, David, is that many people can't return to work because that workplace building is simply gone. Now, today, more than ever, people, can and do work remotely, and that means you can still receive a paycheck. But for many, if that workplace building is destroyed, you could be out of work for 6 to 12 months. And you need to consider that not only will you have those day-to-day living expenses, but also those one-off large cash outflows to rebuild and replace things. Now, if you do lose your job, certainly unemployment insurance does help, but it likely won't be enough to replace your full paycheck.
Now, and you were mentioning, set aside enough money to cover 3 to 6 months of living expenses. That can be a scary number for people also dealing with record high inflation right now, who are struggling to decide, do I pay for my prescription drugs or do I buy groceries? So how do we go about building these emergency funds?
A great question. I'd recommend, the very first step is just simply create a list of your cash income and your monthly cash expenses. And this allows you to at least identify what costs are necessary living expenses. Think, your food and clothing, housing, insurance versus more of those non-essential costs, kind of like entertainment. And every month or paycheck, set aside some of that money to your emergency fund. In fact, some people, set aside their entire annual tax refund. But as you're building this emergency reserve over time, David, it requires a level of discipline to make sure you don't use that money for something else. Just keep it there for an emergency.
And one of those ways that you can make sure that you don't dip into it is to kind of have an account that you really can't dip into without having to go through multiple layers. So what are some of the ways that we can invest some money?
The focus, David, should be, on safe, low risk, but easy to access investments. You want that money there when you need it. Personally, I'd avoid the stock market or anything where, the value, can fluctuate within that emergency fund. Look, the last thing you want is, as we've seen over this past year in the stock market, you don't want to have $20,000 that you set aside in stocks for your emergency fund. But when you need to use it, the value is now down to 15 or 16,000. Same thing with CDs, certificates of deposits. Many have those early withdrawal restrictions or penalties. I'd suggest something very simple, a savings account or even better, David, a money market account. Many of these money market accounts are now offering a 2.25%, 2.5% yield.
Yeah, and we're hearing more and more with reports with Hurricane Ian impacting low-income families the most. Why are we seeing that, and when is it expected, and how is that expected for most natural disasters?
Yeah, well, we are starting to hear a lot of those reports, David, as you just said. Look, historically, low-income families and retirees, they do have less ability to set aside money for some type of emergency fund. Most of their income is already being spent just to cover those everyday basic necessities. but also with this very high rate of inflation. We've already been seeing Americans, being forced to pull money from their savings and retirement accounts just to cover these high costs of consumer prices. And what we're seeing in Florida, though, David, unfortunately, is that many household emergency cash reserves have already been spent just to keep up with this inflation.
Oh, that's so scary. And Mark, thank you so much. A lot of great information as always, and we will see you next Monday.
Enjoy the rest of your week, David. Take care.
You too. Thank you.